And in this half hour of the show, going to be hearing about a book that has a really interesting connection to this time and place. Spencer Stuart is our books expert on North by Northwest, and he's here every once in a while to tell us a story from the history of publishing. And when I called him last week, he told me about a book that suddenly feels quite relevant again after quite a span of time. It was written in the 14th century. It's the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio.
It takes place during the plague. The story itself is centered around 10 people, 7 women and 3 men who are referred to as the Brigata. And what happens is that this group of 10 people who are set in Florence decide to get out of town because of the plague, and it's set around the time that Boccaccio was writing it. And they go to a villa for 14 days. Of course, that number sounds, somehow relevant today, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it's 14 days, but for 10 of them, they decide to sit down, and each one tells a story. And so this results in a collection of 100 stories, all in at the end of it.
So there they are, like you say, out of town, away from the short-lived plague. Was the plague going on? Was there plague around then when Boccaccio was writing this?
Yeah, so during Boccaccio's life, there are 2 definite periods in which the plague goes through Florence, his native town. One in the 1340s, and then one that was another wave that took place at the time in which he was writing the Decameron. And indeed, when he completed it in 1353, it's interesting to note that in the preface, he says that he offers this book as some solace to those who stand in need of it. It kind of became a collection of stories to show a bit of solidarity, and it has, within the 100 stories, it's a compendium, as you could imagine. It's got all sorts of different themes and discussions being brought up in it. It's often known for its more raunchy bits, but there are all these different stories that are told. And indeed, it was sort of a incorporating of stories, local stories within it as well. Historians have worked to kind of peel back the various tales that are told in the Decameron. And indeed, Boccaccio kind of functions as a bit of a recorder of local tales and myths. It sits at an interesting period of time in terms of literary history because it's a secular piece of writing, and it coincides with a sort of change that's happening where the writing and the production of books is no longer staying exclusively within the monastery and in Latin, but is now creating sort of secular material within the cities that are being formed through a more established form of mercantile capitalism. And what's happening is that people are interested in hearing stories of everyday life and everyday experience. So instead of writing in Latin, Boccaccio actually writes in the Florentine vernacular, which is a sort of Tuscan dialect. So it would have been more applicable and understandable by a larger percentage of the population.
And how was it received at the time, Spencer?
It was very popular. It was, books at that point in time, as we know them, did not exist yet. What would happen is that a scribe would sort of write down the story, and that would be purchased by someone. And so what's interesting is that although there are many fragments from that period of time in the 1300s into the 1400s that exist today, there are sort of 2 that really connect with Boccaccio himself. The first one is in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it's actually copied down by a copyist named Caponi, who was based in Florence at the time, and it shows, actually interestingly enough, some images and illustrations to go along with the stories that Boccaccio tells. And then there's a later copy in Berlin now that was done in 1370, roughly 1370, 1371, and that one's actually believed to be written by Boccaccio in his own hand and has certain edits and alterations to some of the stories. So what would happen is that someone would purchase the collection of these stories that were copied down, and then they would enjoy them in that way, and perhaps even translate them, orally to various other people in their family or in the community.
So the copies that were going around, each was written out by hand individually.
That's right.
Huh.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that he completes it in the 1350s, and by the time that one Geoffrey Chaucer comes down to do a diplomatic mission in the region, the various stories of the Decameron were already being, transferred around, and he was. It's believed that at that point, in about 1372, when he was down there, that's where he became aware of the Decameron and went back to England and got to work in around 1387, the late 1380s, on the Canterbury Tales. Which, if you look back at Canterbury Tales and some of the stories that are in there, they're almost direct lifts from the Decameron.
Plagiarism?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Boccaccio himself, there are a number of historians from the period and later that have kind of peeled it back, as I said, and have said, well, that was actually like this was written in Sanskrit, and he's just translating it into the dialect. So there's certain borrowing going on. Again, it's it was really a collection of all various stories, something for everyone, basically.
Now, you mentioned Chaucer and the impact that it had on him. It's a book that continues to reverberate in some way or other over centuries.
Yeah, it's, you within the English context, it's one interesting example is Shakespeare, All's Well That Ends Well, 1605, is believed to be derived from the third day, tale 9 of the Decameron, so sort of elaborated and expanded upon. Interestingly enough, actually 1620 is sort of the first instance of a partial translation of the Decameron into English. It's only in 1886 that a first complete translation of the Decameron is seen in English, and that's done by John Payne. But yeah, it continues to sort of inspire in various ways. In 1805, there was an Italian translation that was made, and it seems to have left quite an impression on some of the Romantic poets at the time. Even before that, actually, you see Wordsworth mentioning it, as well as Samuel Coleridge writing poems to the Decameron, and as well as John Keats and other figures from that period. And it's often seen as something that writers will return to in periods where things are uncertain. Certainly with the Romantic period, you see it with the kind of industrialization and transformations of their society. The images and stories that are set up by Boccaccio are really kind of excellent escapism, and really speak to that power of storytelling in times of uncertainty.
Is there a translation that people turn to if they want to read the Decameron now in translation?
Yeah, in 1972 there was a sort of contemporary English translation that was done through Penguin. That's known as the McWilliam translation. That one's still very readily available in used bookshops. And then also in 2013, to celebrate the 700th birthday of Boccaccio, there was another translation that was done. I think that was published through Norton, and that one's very, very good. And it also has a sort of preface that talks about the various iterations of the Decameron through history. So it's sort of early period in which it was being copied down, and through that various transformations and changes happened to the stories. And then in the 1500s, some of the early print copies of the Decameron, and then on into where it is today, where it's seen in various languages.
I wonder if we'll have a Zoom version after this.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because the whole style of the stories are referred to as framed stories, and I'm sure like yourself and many others, in using Zoom, you're sort of telling stories about your day or maybe ideas that you have, and you see everyone else's faces sort of plotted up on the screen as well. It definitely comes to mind, and certainly came to mind for this topic for the month. So.
Spencer, I find it interesting to think this piece, written, collected, however it was, assembled, 7 women and 3 men. I find that intriguing. So many more women than men featured here.
Boccaccio himself, it's interesting to note that this is his last foray into literature proper. He was also well known for his encyclopedias. Actually, Decameron is the be-all, end-all. He's famous for the Decameron. But he also created these encyclopedias, and one of which is the lives of women in the Renaissance. And so, there's within him, there's interesting instances of celebrating women within his stories. So, it is curious. It's and exceptional too.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Spencer, what does the title translate to, Decameron?
The translation is 10-day event. And so you notice that we mentioned it was 14 days, all in 2 weeks, that they were outside of the city of Florence. But 2 of those days they were in prayer, so they didn't have a chance to sit down and tell the tales then. And then 2 of the other days were allotted for chores. And so it was actually 10 days that they were able to sit down, and each person in the Brigata was able to tell a story. So that's the sort of origin of the name itself.
That's Spencer Stuart. He's our books expert on North by Northwest. And by the way, Spencer recommended a couple of translations of the Decameron, one by George Henry McWilliam from 1972 and a more recent one from 2013 by Wayne A. Rebhorn. And he'll be back again next month on the program.